Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Food Factory for Us 2019 edition, second webinar, How to Make Cheesecake the PM Way, or Project Management Way. And with us today is Raina Svacinka, who you may see in the photo next to me, and he will go through this webinar for the next hour. You are welcome to ask questions during the webinar. On your control panel, you see a questions bar, and you can type your question right into that panel. Rainer, would you take questions during the webinar, or do you prefer at the end?
Well, if there are pressing questions, then obviously you can also do it in between, but I would need you to remind me that there is a question.
Okay, so we'll do it that way. So the attendees, if you have a question, you go ahead and type it in, and then I will remind Rainer, and he will take your question. So with that, I turn it over to Rainer, and let's begin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine. Good. I hope everybody can see my screen. Welcome everybody to my session on how to make cheesecake the PM way. And as you can see here below, there is also the IPMA logo, and this is simply because this scheme, this way of presenting basics about project management, that is an original idea of the IPMA, the International Project Management Association, and I'm following their way of presenting and introducing project management. Let me briefly give you an introduction about myself. I have a background in food and biotechnology. I studied here in Vienna, but then immediately went to consulting and project management. And for the last 12 years, I am developing, consulting and managing international research, development and educational projects. And that concerns Horizon 2020, that concerns Erasmus+, that concerns a couple of national funded projects as well. So I go in there, I help develop those projects together with the scientists. So I always need the experts. I help them to structure those projects. And then once those projects receive funding, depending upon the request, I either consult those projects as an external consultant, or I go in as a project manager and help the project management part. It's a big advantage that I have a food and biotech background because it helps me to understand the project, and it helps me to understand and see issues that might arise from certain things in the project itself, but I'm always depending on the experts and also on people like you, the listeners here, on people who actually have a proper background in a scientific topic. I'm not only focusing on food and biotechnology, I've done also quite a lot of projects in the health area and also in the area, for example, of waste management. So I'm not limited to the food area, but food is simply the point where I came from. I also have my own company, Sumo Technology. I'll show that on the next slide. Here, just a brief overview of some projects I'm running or I ran in the last years. Some of those were, I don't know if you're familiar with the Erasmus Plus funding scheme. For example, is the Knowledge Alliance, which was food related. It was on connecting the European food industry with European universities who have food studies to make a better connection there, to make the education at the university more practical, more relevant for the European food industry. I'm currently together with Paula Pitio, one of the organizers also of this webinar here. I'm supporting her in the coordination of the so-called Ask Food project. The Ask Food project is also a project and knowledge alliance where we are connecting food industry and food universities, and we are focusing on innovative training approaches. So on different ways, not the standard ways, not the classical webinar ways, but on new innovative ways of teaching skills that are relevant for the food industry and ways of connecting the food industry with food studies to simply make the education more relevant and to make also the European food industry more competitive. I also did quite a lot of projects in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, so also the real international ones with third countries. I'm at the moment also a teacher teaching project management at the Applied University in Vienna. So basically, I'm not only implementing it, but I'm also teaching it. We're teaching it there with a colleague of mine together who is an expert in communication and dissemination, because especially when it comes to project management, besides standard project management, communication, dissemination, those are quite valuable and very important points. I have my own company, which is called Sumo Technologies. What we do is we develop digital solutions for different industry. Now at the moment, focusing on the food industry, on the health sector, and I just started to develop the security sector. And what we do is we develop different sets of either training tools or support tools. One of those tools is what we call Imagio. It's a tool which helps organizations with standard interview situations. So we're trying to get away from the standard interview situation where, for example, staff in let's assume you have a production, for example, food production, and you try to connect between those people really working in the production, like for example cutting meat or washing vegetables, and you would like to interview those people and get information out of those people, and then basically communicate this, for example, to management. We have built these tools where you basically sit in front of your computer. They can discuss based on questions. So the tool is asking questions. The tool is presenting situations, is presenting videos, is presenting pictures. And by not just interviewing them, but basically showing them the video and getting them to talk to each other. So it's a group of people sitting there and they talk to each other. And when you see, for example, here the picture, and they talk a little bit about the situation they see here, they talk a little bit about the issues they see here. And by that, it makes it easier to identify issues, for example, in production, but on the other hand, also identify, for example, training purposes, training issues, training gaps where you need to train your staff and improve their skills. The tool itself, it records what you're saying. It tries to highlight keywords which were said. And then in the end, we have an expert going through that list and also making this list more relevant by basically having a look what the program, it's IBM Watson running in the background, is suggesting as most important keywords here, and is trying to, the expert then is basically looking at this and is trying to confirm the order or reshape the order. And then, for example, here, this is a very simple example. Then, for example, if the topic security was very often mentioned, that means that those people working, for example, here in production, they see that security is a big issue. And then if you have then very specific questions, you could identify if, for example, there's an issue with security, if there's training demand with security, or if simply they were thinking that security is a very important point in the production. Good. But let's now start with our presentation. Like I said, this is based on the IPMA approach. The IPMA, International Project Management Association, is an organization that is certifying project management, training, project management skills around the world. I like them compared to the other associations simply because they focus a lot on practical issues. So they are not testing, for example, like with a multiple choice test, all your project management know-how, but they very much focus on the practical skills. And to work on practical skills, especially when it comes to the very basics, they have developed those training scheme where they focus on very simple tasks, such as making cheesecake, and then break it down into project management tasks. Obviously, none of us actually would really break down the process of making cheesecake into project management tasks. This is just simply overdoing it, but simply because all of us, even if we have never made any cheesecake, we all can relate to the simple steps of producing cheesecake. This is just one example. So in this specific example for making cheesecake, they have focused on the initiation, the planning, the implementation, and the project controlling, and tried to basically explain those important project management steps according to the process of making cheesecake. Good. When we have a look, when we start at the beginning, we have always, no matter if it's now this simplified cheesecake project or if we're looking at a bigger project, we always have some point where the project started from. So that is usually some idea, some demand, something where it originally came from that you said, like, we have to do a project simply. In this case, the idea came from you would like to make cheesecake for a friend of yours. Let's assume it's his birthday. And this is the idea. The idea is there's a person having his birthday and we would like to make cheesecake. When we talk about projects, for example, in industry, there could be the demand that they need innovation, for example. They need innovation for their products. They need innovation for their production, for their processes. So there's always a point where it came from. Based on this, then, you try to define so-called objectives. And I guess a lot of you have heard of this term SMART already, that you should always define your objectives in a smart way. SMART here stands for specific, measurable, accepted, realistic, and timely. And that simply means when you're defining now for your idea, for your situation which you're having, you're defining the concrete goals. The idea itself, it's not concrete enough. So you need to define proper objectives, which are very specific for this very specific situation you're having. Ideally, they are measurable, because if they are measurable, it means that you can actually measure if you have achieved your project objectives, or if you're actually having any deviations. It's very important that those are accepted. So that means that you, your project team, your project sponsor, whoever is involved in a project, that they agree that those are the objectives. Because otherwise, if people think of different objectives for a project, that leads to huge deviations, because simply there are different expectations in there. So this is a really, really important point at the beginning of a project, that the objectives of the project are accepted. They have to be obviously also realistic, because if you're doing project planning and you go in with a very unrealistic goal, then your project is deemed to fail. So you will not be able to achieve those. And it has to be timely, meaning that also you have to be able to time it, and to make a time frame for it that is also realistic. And when we look at our example here now, at our very simplified example, here our objective would be, basically we have two objectives. That would be, first of all, you would like to make one classic cheesecake, and the second objective is that it had to be delivered to a friend. And that is
Rainer,
now really, yes,
Rainer, it's Catherine. Cut in for a minute. I wanted to ask you something about the idea.
yes.
I think in the scientific world, in the idea part is where we would have maybe a brief review of what others have done and why we chose this. Like, why did we choose a cheesecake and not a chocolate cake, for
Mhm.
example? So is that true? Am I in the right
Mhm.
place in project management that this is where I justify why I'm following this idea?
Absolutely, you would do it at the beginning. It might be, for example, here they are not going to detail. It could be, for example, that your friend has said that he likes cheesecake, or that from previous experience, from previous parties, you know that this person likes cheesecake, or you simply go the other way and you're saying like, I was chosen to produce to make a cake, and cheesecake is the only cake I can do.
Ah, okay, good.
So that could be. Mhm.
Yeah, I'll take this opportunity to tell our listeners that you can also raise your hand and I can activate your microphone. So if you'd like to ask Rainer a question with your own voice instead of writing it, please go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, thanks, Rainer, for clearing that for me.
Good. Let's now see the smart approach at our example. We have said we have those two objectives, and here you already see why it is so important to have specific objectives, because as you see, the idea was to make a cheesecake for a friend. And here now we're getting more specific, because now you see, especially for the second objective, it says you have to also deliver it to a friend. This here sounds now very simple, but think of a more complex project where things like, for example, in production, and it's missing, for example, the objective that the product you have in the end has to be delivered to a client, for example, or it has to be delivered to a supermarket or something like that. That's why it is very important that those objectives are very specific, and that everybody accepts it. So in this case, one classic cheesecake delivered to a friend. Um, you have here some additional requirements. It has to be 12 servings, because it might be that there are either 6 people present and they all want to have 2 pieces, or it's 12 people present. They would like to have it light sweet. They would like it to have fruits and berries in there, and medium in calories, because they are all very calorie sensitive. In addition, you see here that we have estimated a project time for it with 7 hours and 40 minutes, and a project budget of €8. And here comes into discussion also the thing that it has to be realistic, because here you see, for example, you have 7 hours and 40 minutes time for it, and so you have to make sure that you, when you want to make this cheesecake, and 7 hours and 40 minutes seems to also involve, let's say, for example, buying parts of the ingredients, you have really the time to spend 7 hours and 40 minutes to achieve this cheesecake and to deliver it and get it delivered to a friend, because it might be that the birthday party is on the next day. So really important thing, have it realistic, have it timely. And in addition, you said here you have a budget of €8, also giving you a financial frame for this overall project. When it comes to objectives, usually what we do is we define a so-called strategic objective, a main objective, a so-called specific objective, and what is very often missing is a so-called non-objective. Strategic objective means in the frame of your idea, what is the overall strategy you are actually serving and helping to achieve. And that would be, for example, in our case, very simplified, we are trying to provide a dessert for a party. So we're not talking about the cheesecake here. Issue is they need a dessert, and the project will achieve that a dessert is provided to the party. And maybe, and this is now what I made up, you might want to establish some sort of birthday routine, or you would like to fulfill a certain birthday routine with your project. Specific objective, we had that already. That would be the baking of the cake. And one thing which is, like I said, very often forgotten, but it's also really important to set the frame and the limitations actually of your project would be that you define a so-called non-objective. We have very often have misunderstandings of the non-objectives. Non-objectives, very often people say like, well, non-objectives, that means anything, yeah, anything so I have a project now here about baking the cake, and I could formulate as a non-objective would be not a chocolate cake, not a huge cake, not a cake with 20 servings or something like that. No, a non-objective is something which could be in the frame of your project, but you clearly would like to exclude it to make sure that this is clearly not part of it. In our case, for example, as we said, we make a cheesecake for a friend, to define a non-objective, which is saying we're not making a chocolate cake, wouldn't make sense because nobody would be expecting a chocolate cake if you read the project Cheesecake for a Friend. But it could be, for example, that some people expect that there are raisins in there, that there are nuts in there, that there's something in there which maybe some people don't like. Maybe, for example, here you would like to define a non-objectives, not to put nuts in the cheesecake because somebody's allergic to it. So you would clearly define in the objectives the non-objective of having nuts excluded from your recipe. This is very important. And when you think of more complex project, this could be, let's assume, for example, you're producing a prototype. And the client could think that you're actually not only delivering the prototype, but you're actually also, for example, installing a certain prototype in a factory. So you have to very clearly say that in the frame of the project, this is what's going to be the result, and this is where we clearly stop, and we're not going beyond that, because you have specific budget, specific time frame for exactly what you would like to achieve. And if a client now thinks that you're, for example, delivering something which you do not have in your project plan, then that leaves a lot of problems for you. So for example, in our case, if we would like to exclude the delivery from a friend, and we are saying here we're just making the cheesecake and somebody else is going to pick it up for us, and it's not part of our responsibility to deliver it to a friend, then it could be that you would like to define as a non-objective, delivering it is not part of my project, it's not part of my specific task, and I'm not going to do it. So everybody is well aware that this cheesecake is going to wait in your kitchen till somebody picks it up. As in this situation, we have it delivered to a friend, so everybody can expect that you will make the cheesecake and that it will be delivered to this friend, and that it will, at the project end, arrive at the location of your friend and be available there.
Raina, would you maybe add here that you're not going to serve it, for example?
Could
So
be, for example, yes, absolutely.
Right?
Could be as well.
Yeah, I could see that as a non-objective. You're delivering it, in the box. You don't cut it and serve it also.
Exactly. Exactly. So anything that could be expected of you or of your project and which could lead to a misunderstanding, that you should include here as a non-objective.
I can see that that's very important.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Next thing is then the wording of the objectives, and that's actually a really, really funny story, because at least the field where I come from and the field where maybe most of us are working, the scientific field or research field, very often you have a big difference in how we formulate objectives and how, for example, a standard project manager would formulate an objective. And there are two ways. It's the active or the passive way, I would say. The active way would be, for example, I could, in this case, formulate the objective of my project here is to bake the cake. Or I can say the objective is the cake itself, so the result itself. Very often how we formulate it, that we say that the process itself, so baking the cake, is the objective. Although when you think about it, it's actually wrong, because the baking is part of the project. It's a process to achieve the result, but it's not the objective. So you're not talking about, I would like to bake. You would like to have and achieve a cake. And this is very often, and this is not a mistake, very often it's formulated like that. We're saying like, we would like to develop a certain product. We would like to develop a certain procedure. We would like to develop a certain medicine whatsoever. But actually the objective is, I would like to have this result at the end. I would like to have the updated process. I would like to have the innovative product in the end. And this is very often the difference between how people coming from, specifically from the scientific background, do formulate objectives, and how a standard project manager would formulate the objective, because they would say the objective is a cheesecake. And as you can see it also here, cheesecake for a friend, cheesecake, the classic cheesecake is the objective here, and it's not baking a cheesecake. Good. When we go to the planning steps now, what you can see here are 3 selected aspects of the planning phase. That would be, on the one side, the so-called work breakdown structure, where the work, the tasks, the activities are broken down into so-called work packages and packaged around the activities you would like to do. You have a plan on the resources you require, and you have, this was just simply one plan they selected, the so-called PERT flowchart, which is highlighting the so-called critical path, displaying the path where the project could fail. Well, let's briefly go through it. So here we have, as I said, the so-called work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure is a way of planning, splitting, and displaying your work according to work packages. It's a subdivision, and very often this is a process-oriented or objective-driven. So as you can see here, it's clearly process-driven. You have one whole package dealing with the preparation, one package dealing with the cooking, one dealing with the topping, because it seems that the topping is important enough to have an own work package for it. And in the end, you have the delivery. What you have very often is that those work packages also run in parallel. So I could, for example, imagine that cooking and topping, especially when we look at the last part, could be that some of those activities are simply overlapping so that they are running in parallel. What you can also see here is that it's very important to give those activities a very meaningful title. At the moment here, as we have a very simplified process and a very simplified project, those titles are fine. Everybody from us will know that preparation, what does it mean when I prepare a cheesecake, cooking, topping, delivery. But when you think of more complex projects, you would like to give the work packages very specific and very meaningful names, so that everybody who is involved in a project, when they read it, that they at least get a certain idea what is under this work package. Obviously, you then need also these additional work packages, which you can see below, to give them more substance, but it's really important to have a very, very descriptive title for your work packages. You usually add, and this is not done here, but you usually give it also a duration, and you would add some resources, as well as a leader and a contributor, and also some outcomes, some deliverables, some milestones. Just briefly here, deliverables, I guess everybody knows deliverables would be any result, any output, anything which is quantifiable, verifiable of your project. That would be, for example, in our case, not only the final cake, obviously, but also, for example, the topping, the filling, for example, so you can have some interim results here for your project. And then you have the milestones. Milestones, in comparison to the deliverables, are time critical results, meaning in our case, that would be, for example, when you look at the cooking, you would have to finish the cooking, and you have to have something where you can put your topping on top of it before you can continue with your project.
Rainer,
Yes.
question about the specificity of the names of the work packages. I get concerned about being repetitive. What do you think? Would I say preparation of the cheesecake batter, perhaps, and then cooking the cheesecake? Or am I topping of the cheesecake? Or am I then saying the word cheesecake too much? What's your feeling on repetitive versus simplifying?
As we have here a really simplified project, I wouldn't repeat it simply because we all know it's about cheesecake. But I agree with you for more complex projects where the overall project has several objectives and it's not just simply that every single work package is focused on one activity, namely making the cheesecake. Then it could be, for example, here that we say like it's the preparation of here, for example, they have subdivided into crust and filling. So for example, you could, if those were bigger work packages, you could make two work packages out of it, which one being preparation of crust and the other one preparation of filling, for example.
Okay, yeah. Yep, thanks.
Good. So again, milestone, marking important steps in your project. In this case, for example, it would obviously be having the interim results, for example, having that part of the cheesecake done before you can add the topping, and obviously having it delivered in the end. Those are the important steps, the important points in your project. When we look at the resources here, for example, you obviously see here the classical resources. So you see here on the one side what you would expect, like the cup of cookies, the sugar, the cinnamon, the butter, and so on. But it's also very important not to forget that we also need equipment for it. So as you have listed here, we have the refrigerator, we have the oven here, we have the mixer, we have the other equipment, the kitchen equipment, which we need to do it. This is also very often important, especially when we deal also with bigger projects on innovative products, that it's not only the ingredients which we have to think of when we think of resources, but also of the machinery, of the equipment we need in addition, for example, to bake, to prepare, to mix, whatsoever.
How about people, Rainer? Where do you put the number of people that you might?
Absolutely. You also have to put in here the people, and as you can see here, the last point for here would be, the last point on the first part of the list would be 2 persons. So you would also put in obviously the persons, the personal resources, the experts, and the expertise you would require to achieve the project. Good. And then we have here, just as an example, we have the so-called per chart. So this is just one other chart. You could, for example, also add a Gantt chart. It really depends on what you require for your project. Here in this case, they were simply adding the so-called per chart, which is more of let's say, it tries to display the connections of the different activities you are doing. And in this case here, as you can see in red here, this would be the so-called critical path. So it's this path which actually defines if you stay in time or not. So it's this path where no buffer more or less is. So it's this path has to work with the other paths, like for example the mixing of the filling. As you can see, it takes 20 minutes to mix that, but it takes a while before you need that. So it's not a critical activity. But those activities that are highlighted in red, those are the critical activities that lead each to each other, with one task following the next task. So you don't have any buffer time in between here. So this has to work so that the overall time frame can be achieved, and that the overall time frame is being kept to achieve a timely result in your project. Good. Next one then would be the execution, the implementation of your project. As you can see here, we've basically taken the work breakdown structure as a basis for the description of the different activities. And here on this list, you can see here now some interesting aspects. For example, we start here with heating the oven to 150 degrees, and then you monitor this temperature. And this is now obviously a very simplified example, but that would be, for example, a clear control point. You're clearly saying, I need this oven to be heated up to 150 degrees. Otherwise, I can't start baking my cake, because otherwise the cake wouldn't be baked the way I want it. So it's really a simplified milestone in your project, that this oven has to reach 150 degrees before you can actually continue putting the cake in there. Again, it's simplified, but for example, when you think of production, that could be really important steps that, for example, certain equipment has to be, or certain machinery has to be in a certain stage, has to have a certain temperature, have to have a certain speed and so on, before you can actually really start producing your product. This is a really important milestone in your project, because otherwise, if you haven't achieved this one, then your production is, in our case, that would probably mean that we might ruin our cheesecake, or we might take it too early out of the oven. But in a real production, that might mean if, for example, the steering speed of a certain mix of a blender or so, something like that, is not up to the right speed, that we are basically not mixing our product right, or if certain temperature, for example, in our production is not right, that the product is simply wasted and that we are losing a lot of money. When you look through the other steps, for example, when we look at step 4, there's pour the filling into a pan over the crust. So that would be then basically a deliverable, an outcome we have in the end. We have the crust here. Then you see, for example, under point 5, you have a quality control point in here. We bake until firm except for the very center. So the quality control would be, we check the cake every 16 minutes. So that would be a classical quality control process here in a very simplified approach. And you would have always milestones where you say like, okay, I know it's still, we still have to bake it a little longer. It's still not fully done. And then basically once it is firm according to your expectations, then I can take it out of the oven. Another deliverable obviously would be then to pack the cake in a box, and then I get it delivered to a friend, and having it delivered to the friend and arriving at the friend's place, that will be then your final milestone you have in your project, where you know, now I have achieved my project results, and the cake is where it should be, and I have basically ticked off my objectives and my goals for my project, and the project, at least from this side, would be over.
Brainer, in
Yes.
this part, would you maybe say who is responsible for what? You know, I have seen that in project proposals and as a criticism where we say, you know, heat the oven to 150 degrees. Well, who's going to do that? You know, is it the same person that's going to combine all the crust ingredients?
Mhm.
Is this the place where you would specify who does what?
Yeah, usually in the work breakdown structure, you would take those activities there, the work packages there, and give it a further definition. For example, as you can see here on the second work package, on the cooking work package, there you have the heating of the oven as activity. So there, for example, you would describe furthermore the activity. For example, maybe in this case, you would be overdoing it, but you would describe which kind of oven you would like to have. And as you mentioned, I would give responsibility to a person. And this could be then, for example, that somebody has the over responsibility for it and somebody else is the person implementing it. And it's maybe just, for example, me who has to check that the oven was really switched on, but it might be a friend of mine who is actually the one switching the oven on because I have my hands dirty because I'm just mixing something.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah.
So you would overall do this for every single task. You would have to add responsibilities, management responsibilities, and also persons who would implement it. Usually you have then also graphics which show who has the, for example, the responsibility, who's the person implementing it, and who would be, for example, the person I have to inform. Let's assume I'm baking this cake at my girlfriend's place together with a friend of mine, and then basically I have to inform my girlfriend saying, by the way, we have just switched on the oven, because it might be that she wants to bake something later. So it might be you're the one being responsible that the oven is switched on. You have your friend who is actually the person implementing it, switching the oven on, and your girlfriend who is the owner of the oven is the person who has to be informed about the activity that it had been switched on.
Well, it can get quite complicated, but also
Okay.
very nice to be so specific.
Absolutely. And this is why it is so important to have such a simplified example, because everybody can relate to that. If I would start now with an innovative product and with an innovative process which I'm creating, then some of us might be might feel linked to it because they are aware of how this is done, and others who are working in a complete different field, they might not know what we're actually talking about. Good. Then we have one interesting step, which is described in here, and that would be the review and evaluation step. Why are we actually doing a review or an evaluation? It is simply to identify deviations, to see if there have been any deviations from your original plan. It gives you the possibility to replan, and it's a very important way because we also have to document our project. What do you usually review or evaluate? That would be the time, that would be the finances, that could be the quality of the output, and very often, which is very often forgotten, but we're trying more and more to implement that, that would be also certain social aspects of your project. Who is doing that? It's usually an internal process with internal people doing it, but in addition also externals, which can give you a more objective opinion, a more objective view on your project. And when this is done, usually interim and also final. And when we have now a look at our project, for example, here, it could be that you identify certain deviations. Let's assume we have this list of things you need for implementing your project. And I don't know if now there, for example, were eggs on this list, but usually when you're baking a cake, there are eggs on the list. And let's assume you're a little bit clumsy and you drop some eggs. So you have a clear deviation because now you don't have enough resources to actually bake your cake. So you have to do some replanning because now you have to ask your girlfriend, who is anyway mad because you're using her oven, to go to the supermarket and buy some eggs for you. In addition, this might or will affect actually your finances because now you might have to spend another €1 or €2 on 2 eggs because you just broke it. So you see, you have clear deviations. You have missing resources. You have to involve an additional person doing something, a task which was not on your list, and in addition, you might have to involve additional finances. Now you could say, I don't have any more finances because €8, that's the absolute maximum. So it might be that you want to ring your neighbor's door and ask them if they can give you an egg. They might be a friendly person and they might give you an egg. And in this case, for example, you do not have to extend your finances, and you do not have to send your girlfriend to the supermarket. But in this case, you got it from the neighbor. So there are different ways of replanning. So I'm not just saying that all the time you have to invest in additional finances. It might be that you simply can also alter the recipe, or that you find different ways of dealing with deviations. In addition here, what we can obviously do, or what we should do clearly, would be what we had before already. The timing, for example, you see how long is the oven how long is the cake in the oven? How long did it take? Maybe at the beginning, you switched on the oven too late, so it changes the time. So all the things that are related to the timing, it might also take you a little longer to mix the dough, something like that. That affects it. And then if you had a very concrete time plan, then you have to always check. So after 15 minutes, I wanted to have to achieve this. Are we there? Yes or no? Then we start with the next one. Took 20 minutes for example, in the oven. Okay, then we do the time. Then we do the quality check. So according to your time plan, you would do the time checking and see if you are still on track. Same applies, for example, to the finances, as I just mentioned before. If you have any deviations, for example, might be that you have deviations also in your finances, and then you have to do something. Deviations, just here as a brief excursus, deviations only means that you have it's deviating from your plan. It's not a negative term. Very often I have the discussion and people are thinking that deviations mean something negative. No, it just means that something is deviating from a plan, for example. So it might also be that actually you discover when you open your fridge that there are a couple of eggs in there and you don't have to buy new eggs. So it might be that you're actually you're underspending. So in this case, if you have planned €8 as the price for your cake, then now you discover that you have some eggs in your fridge. That means you are going below the €8. It is still a deviation. So it still means that something is deviating from a plan. In this case, it's just that you're saving money. So deviation is just a neutral term, meaning that it's deviating from a certain situation or a certain plan. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative. In addition, what you always do is always also the quality of your output, obviously. And for example, what you can do here could be a social aspect. So it could be that you are baking a cake for the very first time with your friend, and you could afterwards evaluate, for example, did we work well together? Are we actually a good team, or was I always standing in his way? Was he standing in my way? Did we discover that actually we have a communication problem? We are not really good in communicating with each other when it comes to baking a cake. So you could do some sort of social quality assurance, some sort of social review to see if, for example, in this case, very simplified, if the collaboration between the two of you was a way of how it could work. And as a result, it could be, for example, that for the next time you choose again this person, this friend, to bake together a cake with you, or it could be also that you decide that in the future you would like to bake the cake with someone else. And when you think now of bigger projects, that obviously could have big effects. If you discover that certain groups in your company or certain groups in your research group are not working properly together, or that certain people are simply not the best ones to perform certain tasks, then you can do something and change those and simply improve the results. So it's a simple thing of social controlling to see if such things occur in your projects. From who is doing the review, for example, internally that would be then probably you, your friend, and maybe your girlfriend. And externals, a quality review would be done, for example, by your friends. You're delivering to the party, and then people are telling you, wow, that was a great cake, or maybe, ooh, the crust was a little bit too crispy. So you would get some feedback from your friends, and that would be for example, on the quality of your cake. This can obviously have then also effects. For example, you could document it and see what were the biggest failures in your project. You could also, for example, you could find out, and that was what you, Catherine, mentioned at the beginning, how did we actually decide that we want to go for a cheesecake? It might be that in your feedback, what you get at the end is that people say, like, oh, it was a good cheesecake, but actually next time we would like to have a berry cake, or we would like to have a nut cake or something like that. Or you discovered that maybe 10%, 20% of your friends, they are lactose intolerant. That's why they don't want to have a cheesecake. So there are all sorts of outcomes of this evaluation, which first of all define if your project was really successful, and which give you a great lessons learned for future projects. And that is really, really important thing, because those projects, they might happen again. And you might bake another cake, or certain things such as, for example, the social aspect, that might be an important thing that in the future, when you are working on a different project together, and the same social aspects might apply again. So that could be really interesting for you as well, to see if those social aspects, when you document it, they are of relevance for future projects, for example. Good. Briefly, IPMA is providing a lot of different examples. This is now just showing you the overview. We have, for example, also one on how to make coffee using the PM way, which is focusing on slightly different things. For example, here you can see in the middle, they are using here the example of a Gantt chart. So they are explaining a Gantt chart on the process of making coffee. And we have also a nice other one, which we usually like to present around Christmas time usually, and that is how project managers would wrap gifts. And here you can see, for example, other aspects of project management. They are explaining on the example of wrapping gifts. Here you can see, for example, in the middle, here we have a risk assessment plan, and they are trying to explain how risk assessment works in a project on the example of wrapping a present. You can also see, for example, you see here the project management triangle with time, budget, scope. So here, simply different aspects of project management are explained on the basis of a simplified example. Good, wonderful. So that would be from my side. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Feel free to send me an email if you need something. Like I said, I'm doing project management training. I'm developing international research, development, and educational projects. If there's something where you think I could support you with, just drop me a line, just add me on LinkedIn, and let's see, maybe in the future we get some chance to collaborate in one or the other projects. Thank you. Catherine, are you there?
Put on my camera, but not my microphone.
All right, no worries.
Thank you, Rainer. That was really interesting, useful, and even funny. So that was Great. And we didn't get any questions during the presentation, but I see now just a comment, thank you very much. And we'll wait a few minutes, welcome any questions, either by writing or by raising your hand next to your name. You can raise your hand and then I can turn on your microphone. So if we have any questions, this is the time. I think it could be a useful exercise, Rainer, for a new project manager to make a scheme for something very simple, like
Absolutely,
making a
absolutely,
cheesecake. I think it would be a really good exercise. So here I see a comment. Let's see. Another thank you. Very nice presentation. Great. And I think we maybe have something else. Let me see. Very nice and well explained. Sometimes the goal of a project is not very clear. What is the influence? Wait a second. Let me see if I can get this question bigger. Yeah. Still not good. Sorry. I can't see the question. Close this and reopen it. Yeah, okay. Are there any specific tools that you can suggest for us to use? That's from Luana.
For project management, I mean, it's very, very specific. So it really depends on your project and also on your organization. The first thing which I always recommend is you have a look what tools are available in your organization and make use of those tools, because usually for those tools they are established and agreed in your organization, and usually you have some experts related to it. So that's always the first one. That really depends on if you're working at a university, at research institutions, or at an industry organization. They have very, very different tools. The tools which I'm using at the moment for the project planning is a tool called Smartsheet, which is quite nice to develop the Gantt charts, plus in addition allocate resources, allocate outcomes, allocate responsibilities. So that's a really good one. And in addition, obviously, what you always have to think of, you need communication tools, and communication tools are very often even more important than the classical project management tools. Very often, a lot of those things you would like to do in project management, especially for the simplified projects, you could actually also do in Excel. So if you have a simplified project, don't try to buy a very expensive project management tool, but try to do whatever is possible in Excel. And like I said, Smartsheet would be also a very important one. And for the communication, use the channels which people usually use, the emails, obviously, Skype. If you're using tools like this one here, like GoToWebinar, GoToMeeting, if you're using Teams in your organization, if you're using Slack, whatever tools you have, and please define those tools first, so that everybody knows that when information is communicated, that this is communicated on Slack or on Teams, not that one person is waiting actually on Facebook Messenger to receive it, because we had that too in our project, especially with Southeast Asia. People communicate a lot via Facebook Messenger, for example. So make sure that tools for communication are set and agreed.
Great. I see the question now about the goal. Sometimes the goal of a project is not very clear. For example, what is the influence of something? How do you handle that?
Good question on the influence. I mean, I could interpret that in different ways. I mean, like I said, it's really important that you find out what is actually the purpose behind this whole project. So why are you actually doing it? There's always a reason why you're doing it. If it's just because you're having too much money and spending the money, then it's spending the money, which is never the case. But very often it's some sort of strategy behind it. So you need to fulfill a certain strategy of your organization. You need to fill a certain strategy of the European Commission, whatsoever, and then see how this interlink. So like, how does your project actually influence the strategy? How does it contribute to the strategy? And with which other projects and activities it actually interferes or collaborates? So that I could think. If this question was meant in a different way, just please explain.
Oh, that for me, that's how I interpret also. that when the project is not very clear, the goal, if the goal is not very clear, it's important to look back at what is the initiative for this project, and that should give you the goal.
I mean, what we are trying, but this is simply the role in which we usually are, is that we try to support also the organizations in developing an agenda for research, an agenda for training, depending on the projects which we are developing. So we're trying from the very beginning to find out if there are already any agendas, any strategies available to which we can contribute with our projects, or that we help to develop those strategies and agendas to make sure that the project is actually really delivering something that the organization is looking for, and it's not just another project that is wasting money and in the end delivering a result that ends up somewhere on a Dropbox folder or on a server, or worst case in a lab or something like that, is not being used.
Yeah. Okay. Wait another couple of minutes in case, another minute or two in case there's another question, but we have addressed all the questions so far. I'll remind the attendees that the slides from the presentation will be available on the Food Factory for Us website. And also that at the end of the presentation, there is a very short evaluation, 5 questions, and to please answer that to help us to improve our webinars. And that's it. I don't see anyone else raising their hand or typing a question. So I will say thank you to Rainer, and thank you to all who attended, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.